Lords of Oblivion, the eighth installment of the Shackled City adventure path. This adventure was released in Dungeon Magazine 111 and is a 31-page adventure. Now, it's part one of a three-part series within the overall adventure path. It's followed by Foundations of Flame and 13 Cages. I say it's a three-part adventure, as the events in this adventure take place right before the events in Foundations of Flame, as events go into motion rather quickly once they begin happening, as the schemes of the Cage Rights, the main enemies in the Shackled City adventure path, are coming to fruition, and they come to fruition, well, rapidly as they begin. Now, here we have the opening image. This is the beholder Vhalantru, or aka Orbius Vhalantru, who at this point is the Lord Mayor of Cauldron. As you go down here, see some of his, well, prisoners, apparently. Here's the opening here. Again, written by Christopher Perkins, who's quite famous these days. Artwork by Peter Berting. Cartography by Christopher West. Now, in many of these adventures, you'll note there is a rumor table. Some of these rumors, in this case, are involved with recent events, such as the sacking of the Temple of Ouijas in the prior adventure, which the player characters were responsible for. But some of the rumors here aren't exactly true. They may hear somewhat false rumors of what actually happened, because these are rumors, of course. There's other events happening within the city, some of which true, some of which not true, which I would encourage any DM running this to use this and all the rumor tables here and all these adventures to the best of their ability. As you're going down further here, we got our standard map of Cauldron. Again, this is a pretty good map. I think they've kind of highlighted things better than in some of the earlier adventures. You, of course, get the standard key and all that. And we get to the first segment of the adventure, the Brass Trumpet. And this is the one part, for the most part, in the Shackled City adventure path where the Striders of Flare Lang actually play a part, although it's not a major part. I mentioned before that they're in the campaign, but they're not a major part at all. They more or less hire the player characters one way or another to rescue a member of their organization who has been kidnapped by the Last Laugh Thieves Guild. This is an individual named Skiriol, who's a half-elf strider being a member, not his actual class, and he's being held at the Last Laugh safehouse. Now, the Last Laugh was introduced in the very first adventure and has probably been in the background and has been mentioned in a few different adventures in this story, but at this point they become the initial threat as things continue in this campaign. And again, you get some basic information. It's noted that Skiriol was spying on a house of a noble in town, House Riadave, and when he was captured by the Last Laugh. Now, here you get the safe house itself. This is a quite simple map. It's actually quite small of an area. Each square here is 5 feet by 5 feet. When the player characters come here, they will note that they will be fighting a lot of low-level rogues. If you're running this in 5th edition and not 3rd edition, again, this is the whole series. It was originally a 3rd edition campaign, but a lot of people will probably run it in 5th edition these days. I would recommend just using thugs, spies, or scouts for the majority of these guys. You could come up with a custom low-level rogue build if you want. They are originally 2nd-level rogues, 2nd-level warriors. Any of this will work. The only difference is the 2024 versions of spies, for example, don't have sneak attack, which these guys would probably have. So you could switch them out a little bit and modify them to make them have that. And the other thing you're going to note as you go through the first part of the adventure is there's a lot of traps. The whole place is trapped. There's a crossbow trap here. You get a few others that are kind of scattered throughout the adventure. You get more of these rogues. They're kind of a standard build of low-level rogues. You do get these 2 monks effectively. Now they're listed as a monk 6, assassin 2. You could simply use the martial art adept that's in Voldo's Guide to Monsters with this adventure at this point. You don't need to make them assassins unless you want to be a purist, or if you're just running third edition, obviously you can just run it as it is. Some of these potions, by the way, and items are not in fifth edition, so you might have to adjust them, or you can just give the players the potion, and a potion of Shield of Faith would just act like the Shield of Faith spell, or potion of Mage Armor, which simply just act like Mage Armor. The only thing is, if you bring that into your campaign, it opens the door for these items being a potential permanent item in your campaign, although they probably should exist to begin with in 5th edition. Now, as you're going further in, for the most part, this opening segment is fairly easy to run. Here's another trap, bed of spikes. This isn't that difficult to transfer for 5th edition, but you get a lot of variety, although the confines of the safe house are quite small, and the DM and players will notice that rather quickly. Here you get the image of Jill, the leader of the last laugh, who is, of course, torturing Skiriol. This is kind of a risque image. Show it to your players if you should show it, but I mean it works for the adventure. She is trying to gather information from him the hard way. And Jill again is introduced briefly in the very first adventure in Shackled City. Now, one thing I'll note is you get this halfling rogue and sorcerer named Finch. He is a difficult character to transfer easily if you're bringing it into fifth. You might have to custom build him as he is both a rogue and a sorcerer. That's what I did when I ran the adventure. It's not that hard to do. I don't have a set build for him prepared, but it shouldn't take that long. Now, he's not a major NPC. He's more like the guild's rogue type character. And, he's not going to last very long. So you could switch him out with something a little simpler if you want, but I would definitely keep him as like some sort of spellcaster nonetheless if you want to, transfer it and without taking that much time to do so. So again, some of the treasure might be things that don't technically exist in fifth edition. Many of these things are. And then you get Jill, who is essentially a 13th level character in third edition. If you're running in fifth edition, you could honestly just run her as an assassin and she'll probably work out fine. I think that's what I did in my adventure. I mean, I'm not a big stickler for exactly what level she is or anything like that necessarily. And then some of her treasure you might have to transfer. For example, gloves of a dexterity +6 would not transfer very well, but they did bring gloves of dexterity themselves into 5th edition recently. So you could use those, although it's kind of pointless to put it on a rogue with a very high dexterity score to begin with in the current edition. Some of these items would be a little tricky, like I said, to bring in. Like Wand of Silence don't technically exist, but you could make it like the equivalent of a Wand of Web and just change the spell out and have it function the same way and be the same rarity. Again, there's some tactics suggestions here. Treat these as suggestions. They're not a hard fast rule because obviously no plan survives contact with the enemy, and especially player characters who at this point are going to be able to do many, many, many interesting things. Now, after they finally fight Jill and her various rogues and go through her traps, and eventually free Skiriol, which let's hope that the players actually free him, they will get information more on House Riadave. Skiriol knows about a meeting that is going to happen that night, so this is very time sensitive. One way or another, as a DM, you have to be able to get this information to the player characters. A lot of important adversaries are gathering at this house, House Riadave, in one of the nicer parts of Cauldron and having some sort of secret meeting. This involves the overall plan of what's going on in the city. And there are some interesting people here. If you're transferring this to fifth, this is kind of a difficult location to transfer because there's a lot of interesting NPCs here, but it's not impossible. Now, there are some traps in the house, and as you're kind of going through it, a lot of the house is empty, or there's not a lot of threats. There are some half-orc guards downstairs, and if you're running it fifth, I would just run them as half-orc veterans, and that should work out fine. They're really not that important. They're more like a low-level fight downstairs. My group, just to give you some background, when they got here, they spied the house and they actually used this roof here to get in through the windows and try to break in from there, although one player went in through the downstairs and ended up fighting the half orcs at the same during the same encounter. I'd recommend if you're rolling it on roll 20 or running on roll 20, put these maps on the same page. They aren't that big. Again, I believe these are 5-foot hexes or 5-foot squares. And so it's not that big of an area. Now, note, by the way, this is a manor house. There are some descriptions of these different rooms, but some of them are left pretty blank. The DM might want to use this opportunity to add a few art objects into different rooms, possible treasure that the players could find, but you could also throw some extra threats into some of these back chambers. Like maybe there's a locked door, and the reason it's locked is, there's some sort of construct back there that, you know, the leader of this house keeps there and just doesn't have in the main chamber. Because as you'll soon find out, the chamber upstairs, it's actually, I believe it's chambers R29 and 27, are very crowded. There are quite a number of individuals in these rooms for this meeting, and again, upstairs, and it's going to be a very compacted fight. I would also recommend, if you're going to use this map, at least show some of the outside area, because the player characters will probably try to use some of that area to be able to move around the house. Or, I mean, there aren't a lot of windows on the other side of the house, but there's a good chance they might try that. And there are a few traps here as well. Most of these traps, if you're running in 5th, are going to be pretty easy to transfer. Now, as you're going through the house, and again, add some unique art objects. Also add some weird objects that might be interesting, like maybe like some sort of bust of a demo dand or something like that, or something that fits the theme of Carceri. That's kind of a foreshadowing of things to come. Would be an interesting idea. They do give you some extra suggestions here that might help as well. Here we have the house itself. You get what the rooms actually are, but you don't get that much description on each one of them, which I think is one of the only flaws of this adventure. Now, you do get the house staff. There's 6 individuals, halflings, that work here. They could make good NPCs to try to get information out of. You get the half orc, what I call, well, they're veterans in 5th edition, I guess, but more of these half orc mercenaries that been introduced earlier in the campaign. I'll note, if you look at their magic items here in 5th edition, their magic items don't work very well. You could probably take away the +2 chainmail, which would be a very rare and very expensive item for each of them to have, and just give them a half plate. Otherwise, the player characters are going to get way too much valuable treasure, and I don't think this was the intention of the original writers to do that. They could have +1 weapons, which isn't super expensive, and obviously give them the potions, because this would be a greater healing potion, or 2 of them. But maybe instead of having +2 chainmail, maybe they have something else that kind of beefs them up a little bit that isn't so exceedingly valuable. Even chainmail +2 chainmail is kind of a weird magical item, and it is not a very in demand magical item at their level. Like I said, it's easier just to give them split mail, or something similar, half plate. And one of the issues with 3rd edition is they tend to hand out tremendous amount of magic items in higher level adventures, which can easily unbalance a campaign. There's also some gold players might find. You get Lady Riadave in her house, vaguely what she looks like, and you get kind of further in here, and here's a note on looting the house. And again, this is something I've kind of talked about. There is some valuable items, but they don't go into detail about it. This adventure focuses more on the meeting, which would be nice if they detailed some of the rooms a little bit more, because many player character groups are going to want to raid this house and just take things just because they can and all that. This is also a great opportunity to put in a couple of interesting cursed items, like if the player character just grabbed the wrong thing, it's stuck to their hand, or they automatically become cursed, or something. Like, I don't know, maybe like a pouch that's really interesting that is just filled with lodestones, which are like little 1-pound river rocks made of lead that they automatically become cursed with, and maybe there's 50 of them in there, and the player character suddenly gains these stones that take up 50 pounds of their inventory, which they can't get rid of. It's also an interesting item if you want to bring it in, because player characters could use them as rocks that come back to them, especially if they fight with a sling. Just something I've used before in some of my campaigns. Now, this adventure also requires the player characters to get here at a certain time, and it relies a little bit on coincidence. The players get here and they overhear some of the conversation. The player characters might simply interrupt this conversation and not gather enough information. And if they do that, that's on them. But the player characters do need to know some basic things. There are demon dans involved in the plot, and if they do listen to it, they will get a good idea of what is actually happening behind the scenes, who the Shackleborn are, what's going on with Karsiri and the plan to open a giant portal, essentially in above Cauldron and turning it into a gate town, allowing the Shackleborn or allowing the Demodans to come and go freely from Karsiri and into Cauldron. It's a nefarious plot. Now, if the player characters interrupt this and they don't get the whole information of like what the Tree of Shackled Souls is, which by the way is something they will find in 13 Cages, and they don't go through all of this, the important points I would stress is that Orbius Vhalantru is definitely in on the threat. One way or another, the players should get that information because that leads to the next segment of the adventure. Now, I'll note that player characters might have abilities that are unintended, either if you're playing it in 3rd edition or 5th edition or whatever edition. They might have, say, the ability to gather more information that the DM really wants, and that's exactly what my group did. They actually had a Dybbuk, and the Dybbuk inhabited a corpse and gained information on who all the cage rights were. And they got that information and, were able to use that against the cage rights and as the campaign continued. But again, this adventure, the follow up, and the one after that take place right after each other. And then even the follow up after that, it takes place shortly after, well, after 13 Cages, which deals directly with the cage rights. So this information is not terrible if they get the information. And there's a lot of information that where it could lead some interesting directions if somehow they gain extra information as a result. Now, I'm going to note as well, because the adventure that follows this, which is Foundation of Flame, is more of an event-based adventure where the portal is being opened. I would recommend the DM start having events from that adventure happening in the beginning of this one. For example, only minor things like the city begins experiencing earthquakes, or some strange fiendish creatures that might have come from Carceria are slipping little by little into the city, or player characters are having nightmares, or maybe you could treat it as the dream spell where they're witnessing Carceri, and not every night, but more and more people are seeing these things, or just odd things that sort of begin that adventure as early as you can here. You don't have to use all the events because there's a lot of different events in that particular adventure, but some of them should already begin as a precursor to this adventure. And that's kind of how I ran the adventure itself. I find that much of that adventure is a little bit difficult to run and really relies on the players choosing to help the individual people of the city in that adventure. I won't go into detail with it with this review, though. Now, they do get a description of basically what happens in the meeting. Good chance, again, that this will get interrupted, but go through it if you can. It's great information. It's kind of like an info dump on the players, a chance for them to know what's actually happening. But again, player characters have a habit of interrupting things in different ways. The tricky thing about this adventure, again, is if you're transferring it, how to transfer this without spending, tremendous amounts of time getting all this information into fifth. I'd recommend, for example, though, if you're using for Lady Yadave, that she could just be a transmuter. There's a transmuter in Volo's Guide. There's an individual in here, although I want to know she has an eye ray connected to her. It's one of Vhalantru's eye rays. And in this case, at the time, it's a inflict wounds spell, effectively, but I would still give her that. It's very interesting, and it implies there is a beholder present, or that will soon be present. Now, you might have to go through her spells and alter them so that they fit 5th edition. And again, her magic items are quite extensive. You would have to go through them. I would actually even look through them if you're running them in 3rd edition and decide whether or not she's going to have all these things. Like, I actually gave my players the Ring of Protection +2, which I treated as a very rare item. Some of these items, like the Wand of Magic Missile, transfer very easily. There's not, but I would recommend giving the players a good amount of magic items in this adventure because they're going to earn it because this fight is very dangerous and it's a major pivotal point in the campaign. Now, she does have a shield guardian. That is a creature that's in 5th edition. There's this dwarven merchant here. Here's some of the individuals they encounter. Again, the great thing about these adventures is you get a lot of interesting art that you can share with people or your player characters. For example, this is the vampire mod who likely will escape in gaseous form. He did that in my game. You get just individuals. Here's the dwarven merchant who looks very scheming, and just other people. These are great images to share. This merchant, for example, he's a fighter rogue. You don't have to make him a rogue, and if he's wielding like a dwarven war axe or something like that. In 5th edition, that won't work with sneak attack, so you might want to just make him be, some sort of higher level, roughly 10th level mercenary. There's a lot of different builds in Volder's Guide you could use, but try to use a little bit of variety. He could be a knight and just alter him a little bit. There's a lot of different things you could do, or make him like a tough boss or something. He's not that important overall what exactly his stats are, as long as he fits the general role of this, tough dwarven mercenary type. You also get these two other dwarves that are his assistants. Honestly, you could make them veterans, dwarven veterans, and it would work fine. Just keep an eye on the magic items that they have and equipment because it's going to be overwhelming and it could break your campaign. Now, here you get another member here who is a 10th level cleric of Nerul, a god of death. You could use I think it's called the Arch Cleric or Master Cleric in the 2024 Monsters Manual. It would probably work fine. I have created a 2014 version of a Death Cleric, which you can find on Dungeon Masters Guild, which will also work really well for this. I think I actually used it for this and for some other campaigns. You could probably find some just random homebrew stuff just on the internet as well. This necromancer, for example, it doesn't really need to be anything too special. You could just use the necromancer from Volo's Guide. You get up here and you get Maud, a female half elf vampire who is a monk slash, I think, shaman in 3rd edition. Honestly, you could just use the standard vampire, it will work fine. If you want to be a purist, you could add the monk levels, and she will be way more powerful than she's intended to be, and I don't think she needs to be. Now, for the second time, you get dread wraiths, and this one has a name, Hate, which there aren't a very good, conversion of dread wraiths that I've seen in 5th edition. So you could just upgrade these from their hit dice and what their damage can do from a normal wraith, and it should be fine. It's not a it's not a major enemy. So they should, if you use the last adventure where the dreadweights show up in at the Temple of Joss, just use whatever you use there, and it would be fine. It's not that big of a deal if this doesn't fit the original stats for dread wraiths. Now you also get this tiefling sorcerer. You could just use him as a mage unless you can find a good sorcerer build. I have built an arch sorcerer build, but it's a little higher level than this. That's on Dungeon Masters Guild. Or you might be able to find just some homebrew sorcerer on the same level. Or if you custom build it, just treat it like a sorcerer in the current edition that you're using. In 5th edition, they should have sorcerer's abilities and not just mage abilities. But I'll be honest, you could treat him like a normal mage out of the 2024 Monsters Manual, and it will work fine. There are two Babaus. Their Babaus are in 5th edition no matter what. And there's this half fiend cleric slash rogue. You could use him as a cambion as an example and just kind of merge him with the cleric or the priest from the Monsters Manual and just beef up his challenge rating. It might take a little bit of work to do it. And then as you're going further in here, there's an ogre mage. Again, in 3rd edition, they give him some fighter levels to beef him up. You probably don't need to do that. This is already a pretty hard fight. Just make him an ogre mage in 5th edition. And as you're going through, you get some other basic information about these individuals. So it's quite the big fight. And again, it's in confined spaces. And these are major enemies that are just part of the grand conspiracy here. And, they're up to a lot of no good. But this is really when the plot thickens the most in this campaign and really gets moving after, 8 adventures of hints and subplots and everything like that. And anyways, eventually this adventure will go towards, well, Vhalantru, the fiendish Shator beholder in this adventure, who is not the main boss of the entire campaign, but he's probably at this point in your campaign been built up because he is the so-called Lord Mayor of the city, or the Lord of the city, however you want to do it. And, he's somebody that will be quite memorable, most likely at this point in your campaign, and a memorable boss to have to beat as a beholder. Now, as you play your characters, they have to learn that House Vhalantru obviously is the home of Lord Mayor Vhalantru, and that he is definitely a threat. He is part of the conspiracy, so they will likely go to House Vhalantru. I'm going to note in this adventure that this adventure is very time sensitive, so if the player characters decide they're going to take a long rest after the House Riadave segment, which by the way happens at night, they will probably have to deal with some consequences in the morning. If they go rest at an inn, odds are Vhalantru will have heard about the attack on House Riadave and will send the city guards looking for the player characters. So there's a good chance that the player characters will have to deal with the city guards in a very violent manner, either at the inn or somewhere in the streets. If they're sleeping in a safe house or resting somewhere hidden, then they have a better chance of not having to deal with that. But as a good possible random encounter in the city the next morning, I would say that they probably have to encounter more half orc guards or just more members of the city guards, and don't be light with it. I mean, you could put them against maybe a half dozen, half orc guards, and maybe you could put them against 1 or 2 dozen city guards that are just under orders to attack the player characters on sight, kill them or arrest them, and it should be a show of force. Like, this is they're not playing around anymore. They will try to kill the player characters on orders of the Lord Mayor, who will try to stop them at all costs. You could even throw in a couple of extra mercenaries into a fight like that. So it's not just a bunch of melee enemies. Like, maybe there's an enemy cleric or a low level enemy mage, something to kind of beef it up a little bit. There could also be a bounty on the player character's head, of a sizable bounty, and the player characters might get attacked by a couple of other random mercenaries, maybe even someone they know who turns on them. This is an opportunity for a good betrayal. In fact, here we go. It's noting that the town guards or the mercenaries, um, here in the adventure, although this is referencing the fact that there are a couple of half-orc guards or veterans in Vhalantru's manor. As you go down here, you get more information on his manor. Again, you get the names of what the rooms are, but not a lot of description, which again is one of the only flaws I have with this adventure. But it's at the same time, it's not a super big flaw because the adventure doesn't want the player characters to focus on searching the house and anything like that. They can do that, and you could put some interesting items in the adventure a little bit to give it a little more description. The house itself is two-storied, the manor, I should say, and there are some people who work in the house that are kind of the staff. Actually, I should say it's three-storied because it is. I only see two maps here. But the player characters should explore the house entirely, and eventually they're going to find a secret chamber, which I believe is V9, where there's simply a strange hole that drops into the floor. And it might be a little bit tricky to find it, but that's the direction they're going to end up going. You note here these half orcs, again, 5th edition, run them as veterans. There are some other monsters in the house, and I think there are some traps here as well. Here's one. For example, there's some spirit nagas. These are pretty appropriate for their level. There's some half orc zombies. Again, in 5th edition, you could just use basic zombies. And there are 3 Farastu Demodans, which are going to be very dangerous. And at this point in the campaign, the players are going to be fighting a lot more Demodans, and they become increasingly more dangerous as the campaign continues, as you start getting Calibars and eventually some Shatars. Now, eventually the player characters will get beneath the house into Oblivion, which is Vhalantru's actual lair, and it is a descent. They come into this area 01, and then there's another hole that goes deeper down, and it just gets darker and more interesting. There's other shafts that descend downwards, and it's 3 levels deep. There are also these interesting doors, which are meant to be difficult for the player characters to open, but they're meant to be easy for Vhalantru to open as he moves around his lair. You will also get some very interesting, creepy, and gross artwork, which is very fitting for this lair. It's pretty gross. It's pretty. It's a beholder's lair. It's not meant to be pretty. You do get some decent descriptions here, and here's the information on the Oblivion doors. They actually require a specific spell to open each door, and they're very hard to open. Just opening them because they weigh well, more than a ton. The player characters at this level, though, should have some interesting abilities to open them. For example, if they have the knock spell, that might open them, or if the players have the ability to go through a wall, that might be a way to open them. They're going to have a lot of tricks up their sleeves, but it should not be easy to open and keep all these doors open in general. Now, as they're going further in, they deal with a lot of traps. If they don't open the doors correctly, if they fail a sleight of hand or thieves tools check, they're going to get blasted with 1d10 rays of force. I mean, you could treat these similar to, say, an Eldritch Blast, or similar to a Ray of Frost, but do force damage, or something similar in 5th edition. But they're going to get hit by these all the time, especially if they can't figure this out. It is a moderate challenge. Now, further in the adventure, you're going to get creatures called Nessian Warhounds. There's no easy 5th edition version of these. They're basically advanced hellhounds to a certain degree. They're like large size hellhounds. Because of the limitations on the size of this adventure, each square being 5 feet, they're not going to have a lot of space to move around. So it's going to be kind of tricky, and it's kind of one of the criticisms I have with adventures like this, where the areas are so small and there's so many enemies there. It's the players might actually have an advantage just being high likelihood that they're going to be more mobile. A lot of players end up building characters in the long run that end up being very mobile. There's a lot of enemies that are designed are just not that mobile, maybe unintentionally. Now, these particular creatures, you could just take the Hellhounds and beef them up with their hit dice and their damage, and it should be fine. Again, you look at these magic, or not magic items, but these treasure items that they have, these collars set up with diamonds and rubies. They're quite valuable. 5th edition or 3rd edition love to just throw out treasure like crazy at this point. Granted, the player characters will be roughly 13th level as they're going in this adventure, something around that lines. Getting tons of treasure might unbalance the campaign at this point a little bit, but as they level up and continue the campaign, it's not going to matter that much. The campaign will come to an end roughly around level 20, and eventually that's not going to be that big of a deal, but it will become a problem if they get way too much all at once, which, like I said, there's a lot in here. They get way too many, for example, very rare magic items or something similar. Now, as they go in further, they're going to come here and they're going to be some enemies called Hyrachnins. And I found this page, by the way, on Forgotten Realms Wiki, what a Hyrachnin is. It's essentially a hellhound that's been turned into a humanoid that looks kind of like an orc. There's not a lot of information on them, but like the Nessian Warhounds, you can base them on hellhounds. I mean, one idea that if you want to build a very simple version of them is take the Hellhound's breath weapon and sort of take the Globberzoo and make it medium size, and you can kind of work with it a little bit and set it up to be what these creatures are. I cannot find a 5th edition conversion or anyone that is really designed a really good Hyrachnin, but it isn't that hard to transfer. It's just a little tricky at best, and but these guys, whatever you use for them, keep the stats for them because they will come to play in the next couple of adventures, especially in 13 cages. They're kind of just the meaty guard enemies of this adventure and also of 13 cages on top of the demo dans, which the players will fight more of them. Now, as they're going in here, one thing I recommend is have an earthquake take place, which is an event. The events that start happening in Foundations of the Flame, and just to remind them that things are starting to get worse in the city. And again, some of these Hyrachnins have levels. You don't necessarily need to give them that in 5th edition, as long as they have a pretty decent hit dice and a lot of hit points and can do a lot of damage, they should be fine. You do get this well, they have the ability to command, Nessian warhounds and hellhounds, but that's not going to be the most powerful ability. Here's a good image of what they look like. And again, a Nessian warhound effectively. And as you go further in, and they go deeper and deeper, they do find some treasure. There are some stone golems. Those are pretty easy to bring in. Eventually, they get to the main boss of the adventure, Vhalantru, a Shator Tartarian beholder. In third edition, they did come up with a template for creating Shator Tartarian creatures. Essentially, he has a lot of extra traits from the Shators. If you want to build them like this, which I would suggest doing something similar, take away his central eye ability, because his central eye, as you saw by that opening image, looks like the face of a Shator. So Shators are in 5th edition. Give him some of the abilities of the 5th edition Shator if you're writing in 5th. Like, for example, he has the paralyzing slime ability in 3rd edition, and as well as some spell like abilities that he might have gotten from the Shator. You can give him these abilities, but he's already going to have a lot of stuff that, just as a beholder, you might want to consider beefing up his hit dice a little bit. And if you give him these abilities, raise Valanthu's challenge rating to a bit higher than what it is in the whatever monsters manual you're using, because he is a definite boss threat who should be a very unique looking beholder that would be very memorable for the player characters to fight. In my campaign, I ran him as a basic beholder, but I honestly kind of wished I'd gone back and used the Shatorian idea and shown the opening image, because I never really used that image, and to make him a little more memorable. But I digress. Now, you will see there's the template in 3rd edition. You could use that a little bit in 5th edition to kind of build him up a little bit. He has some extra resistances and immunities and all that, and that would definitely make him more powerful. He gets a rage ability, which would be useful if he's using his melee bite attack and all that, if you use these abilities, but it's not 100% necessary to use these things. And again, you just get some basic information in 5th edition, well, in 3rd edition, about different things. For example, the last laugh, which the player characters have mostly dealt with, but it does have other high ranking members, which the player characters could go after in a follow up adventure, or likely they would go after the player characters, as there's likely going to be a bounty on their heads because of taking up their safe house. There are, again, recurring villains, petrified ancients, all these sort of things that would make really good side adventures as the campaign goes on. And I always recommend with campaigns like this to do side adventures that are not part of the main campaign, and give the players the ability to follow on these leads if they want. It allows time to pass, which at the moment, a lot of things happen in this campaign where sometimes should pass. I For example, the campaign should begin in the fall because flood season happens in the beginning of winter, and then some of the other adventures are said to take place in the beginning of spring. At this point, it doesn't really matter what season it is. You could say it's early summer, but it's not as important. As long as some time has passed and you allow players to either take downtime or they travel out of the city enough that some time can pass because of that, and that happens as a result. It will allow events to take place easier, especially because this campaign is somewhat seasonally based, only somewhat though. Now, overall, for this adventure, it does have some minor flaws, but I wouldn't say they're that important because they kind of make sense. Really, the only flaws are the fact that some of the locations don't have a lot of descriptive text. They have some, and they're not a lot of description of what is entirely, the little items that should be in these locations, like, art objects that would be very interesting, or extra creatures that might be locked in a back room, or little side things. So as a result, I would rate this adventure a 4.5 stars out of 5. There's quite a lot of variability. It is interesting that it is all taking place in and under Cauldron, which variability makes a great adventure. There's lots of different creatures the player characters are going to encounter in the adventure, some of which are going to be difficult to transfer to 5th if you're running it in 5th. And there's a lot of different types of enemies they're going to encounter. In fact, and the fact that it's time sensitive as an adventure is going to play out really well, and it's going to be a bit different than some of the other campaigns, because if they do wait too long to deal with, say, Vhalantru, then Vhalantru is going to strike back one way or another. And the longer they take, the more forces he's going to gather to do that. And he might send, for example, some Haraknins after them, and they might not know what those are, and might have to deal with that. And it might be a much bigger threat if they, for example, leave the guild house and decide they don't want to follow up on what's happening at House Riadave, they might miss that event entirely, which will drastically change the adventure's events, where they might have to deal with individual members of the house, and perhaps they meet with them or they encounter those enemies at different times, following down different routes and different leads, but also they won't get the main information for the quest so easily. Maybe they eventually hear about Vhalantru being behind things or rumors about him, and they still go to House Vhalantru and raid the place and go into Oblivion. But maybe they find information that about some of the members of at House Riadave's meeting that are out there and are known members or associates of the Cage Rights, or perhaps some of those members are in Oblivion or out at House Vhalantru while the players go there. In any case, the DM, should use those individuals as future prominent threats. And I'll give you an example. The vampire mod, for example, I think she's expected to survive, as she has sort of a coffin in at Shatterhorn. It's one of the later adventures in the campaign, and there's a good chance she shows up there. That adventure states that if she survived, she will likely come back here and will be encountered again. That's what happened with my campaign, as she turned into a gaseous mist and was able to escape. It's very difficult to stop her from escaping, but the players could possibly do it. Now, like I said, there are consequences if they don't basically if they don't deal with the time constraints of this adventure, and the DM should really emphasize that time is ticking and they will have to deal with that. But there will be consequences for the player characters even completing this adventure. Shortly after the events or during the events of this adventure, the attempt to open the portal Carceri will begin to open, and the events, and I emphasize the word events in Foundation of Flame, will begin or will have already begun. There'll be a lot of earthquakes. There'll be, buildings collapsing. There'll be fires in the streets, fire elementals. I won't go into much detail beyond that, but those events should already begin happening. And when I talk about Foundations of Flame and how to run it, like I said, one of my suggestions is to begin running that adventure at the beginning of this adventure. Have some of those events happen, and you'll be able to run it a little smoother, or it'll make a lot more sense than the events suddenly taking place. Now, again, if you guys like my reviews and want to see more of them, please like and please subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. And stay tuned for the next adventure review.